So I call this lecture Rising from the Rubble, Creating POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews, because you'll see in a moment where we've actually located this museum. We've literally located it on the rubble. But I want to begin with a statement by Arnie Eisen, Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, who attended the grand opening of POLIN Museum in October of 2014, and who was really, I think, very, very surprised. And what he said has resonated with me ever since. It's not often that a museum makes history as well as chronicles it, and rare too when otherwise cautious observers remark at the opening of a new museum that it may prove a source of hope and pride that propels an entire society forward. Both of those things happened this week in Warsaw with the opening of POLIN Museum. This really echoes, I think, Sue's comment at the very beginning, which is the surprise that such a museum could actually have been created in Poland. And today what I'd like to do is to really take advantage of my own role as chief curator of the permanent exhibition and offer you a curatorial, behind-the-scenes look at the making of the museum and the creating of this extraordinary thousand-year story. Now, as I indicated, what's really critically important is the location of the museum, and it's located literally on the rubble, which is why the title, Rising from the Rubble, is really so appropriate for today's presentation. This is what the area where the museum is today located looked like after the Germans suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and then leveled the entire area, which had been the Warsaw Ghetto, and it was the pre-war Jewish neighborhood of Warsaw. This is where really the most vibrant Jewish community in all of Europe and one of the most vibrant in the world lived before the Holocaust. And so it is on this rubble that we have created the exhibition. And in fact, the location is one I think familiar to many of you, whether or not you've actually visited Poland and visited Warsaw, which is that we are located facing the monument to the ghetto heroes. This is a photograph on the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. As you know, the uprising broke out on April 19th, and we will be commemorating it this year in just 2 weeks. And that was actually Erev Pesach in 1943. 5 years later, just after the end of the war, there was the unveiling of the ghetto to the monument to the ghetto heroes. And you can see that the rubble has not been completely cleared, and that one literally had to climb the rubble to get to the monument. But in the background, you can see the destroyed city of Warsaw, because a year after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, there was the Warsaw Uprising, and the Germans suppressed that uprising and destroyed 85% of the historical core of the city of Warsaw. So the entire city was in ruins, but this area was absolutely leveled to the ground. Now, until we opened our museum, the only significant, I would say, the only kind of icon that indicated that Jews once lived here and that they also died here was this monument. And in its time, it was monumental. And of course, over time, the rubble was cleared. The monument was given a plaza and a beautiful park behind the plaza. Communist era apartment blocks went up because you can imagine the housing shortage. But this was it. If you came to Warsaw, there would be almost no physical material trace of Jewish presence. And so it was decided in 1993 as an idea that then became a project, that then became the museum, to actually recover the thousand-year history of Polish Jews. And the starting point was really, the inspiration was really the opening of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington in 1993. And representatives of a Jewish NGO in Poland actually attended the opening. And they were really, really impressed with this extraordinary multimedia narrative exhibition. And they came back to Warsaw and they said to the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, the Jewish NGO, they said, you know, if there's a Museum of the Holocaust in Washington, there should be a Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. That this history has been overshadowed by the Holocaust, and it is a very important history to recover. And so that was the idea. It became a project in 1996, but still the museum was not founded. And the museum was then founded in 2005. Now, in 1996, the city of Warsaw said, if by some miracle this museum should ever come to be, we will allocate a location for it in front of the monument to the ghetto heroes. And that was the perfect location because we think of the museum as completing the memorial complex. We go to the monument to honor those who died by remembering how they died. And we come to the museum to honor them by remembering how they lived. That the task of memory is not complete if we only remember how they died, that we have a moral responsibility to recover their history, to recover their memory, and to recover the world that was destroyed with them. And so that was really the impetus for creating this museum and putting the museum that honors their lives in a relationship to the monument that honors those who fought and those who perished. And the museum itself is a wonderful study in contrast. The architects for the international competition that was held in 2005 when the museum was established and actually founded were given the mandate to create a building that would not overwhelm the monument. And the monument is not really particularly monumental by today's standards, and that would stand in a respectful relationship to it. And so it does. It's a beautiful building that is minimalist on the exterior. It is clad in glass. It stands in this perfect relationship to the monument. And the glass itself is like scales on a fish, not a sheer surface, but it is inscribed with the word POLIN in Hebrew letters and Latin letters. And of course, that's the name of the museum. And I'll explain the reason for that in just a moment. But this shimmering glass building is an architecture of hope on a site of tragedy. You never see a glass building, or rarely, I can't even think of a glass building on a site of genocide. You're more likely to see a building made of titanium, of concrete, of steel, of rusted. In other words, you're more likely to see a building that is evocative of the Holocaust and not a building that is transparent, reflective, open, and this very sort of shimmering, beautiful, beautiful building. Now, when it came to the inside, that's where the architect, Rainer Mahlamaki, Finnish architect who won the competition, put all the drama. So you have this very minimalist, this rather austere, but very beautiful glass exterior, and then you have this very warm, organic interior that's inspired by the canyons of the Judean desert in Israel, and a feat in terms of architectural engineering, an absolute feat. And the building is filled with light, and that's the message. It is a building that communicates openness, light, transparency, and reflection. And it is in that way a story that has at its heart a very, very tragic aspect, but at the same time, it is also a story that is filled with hope. Now, and here you can really see the drama and the contrast between the interior and the exterior. Okay, just one second. Now, when it came to making the exhibition, we found a solution that was good for the architect, good for us. And that is that the architect gave us the entire footprint of the building below ground to be able to create the exhibition without any limitation in terms of the space itself, the nature of the space. But that also gave him the freedom to create a beautiful architectural interior without having to accommodate the exhibition. And that separation, I think, is really the making of the museum. So we descend this staircase, which is a really dramatic staircase, and that takes us down to the exhibition level. Now, that rubble is not only an indication that the historic district was gone, that there were no buildings. The Nozik synagogue survived. One of the buildings attached to the great synagogue on Tlamatsky survived. The Jewish cemetery survived. But the rest of the Jewish neighborhood is gone. And it's not only that which vanished, but it's also that we began without a collection. Now, we have been forming a collection, but this is a 1,000-year story. And there is no collection in the entire world, not public, not private, that has in it the objects that would be needed to tell this 1,000-year story in a way that is truly compelling. and I'll show you in a moment what kinds of objects there are and how we addressed this lack of appropriate objects. So even if we had been able to buy or loan objects that do exist, there aren't enough, and there aren't enough of the right ones to tell the story. So what did we do instead? What we did instead was to create what I like to call a theater of history, a multimedia narrative exhibition that communicates this story in a way that makes our visitors actually actors in the story, because it's only as you walk through this multimedia narrative exhibition that the story itself unfolds. And that one of my tasks today is to show you how do we do that, how does it work, and why is it so powerful. So here is a good example of our theater of history approach, which is, and we'll come back to this, this is an image of the partitioning of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth between 1772 and World War I, when Poland, as we know it, disappeared from the map and was now divided between the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Kingdom of Prussia. And we wanted to communicate that, and we do it through these oversized portraits, through maps, through the last king of Poland whose throne is empty. And we've created a kind of environment in which we can implot the story. And so this would be a kind of, I would say, good indication of our general approach. Now, it's not that we don't use objects, and it's not that we don't show objects, we do. Original objects, as well as facsimiles, copies, replicas, scale models, we do all of that. But think about what exists. So this is the most important collection of Jewish objects related to the history of Polish Jews in Poland. And there isn't really, I mean, there are also objects at in Israel, at the Israel Museum, at the Jewish Museum in New York. There are, but what are they? They're, first of all, almost entirely from the 19th and 20th century. And our story begins in the 10th century. They are mainly paintings, drawings, photographs, Judaica, memorabilia, like medals, coins, but there's nothing absolutely, I mean, for the medieval period, as I'll show you, there are basically two kinds of objects. That's it. And it's 500 years. So essentially, even though there are objects, there aren't enough of them, and there aren't enough of the right kind of them to allow us to base this exhibition on objects primarily, I mean, not alone out of the question, but even primarily. And so we decided to create this theater of history. Now, what's very special, because I know that many of you will be interested in how this museum functions in Poland today and its relationship with Polish historical policy, the Polish state, and the whole situation in Poland today. And I think in order to understand that, it's important to stress that the museum was created as a private-public partnership, and the first and most important one for a major cultural institution in Poland. And that is that it was initiated by the Jewish NGO, the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, which was established in Poland in 1951, and as an idea in 1993, as a project in 96. We developed a plan for the exhibition between 2000 and 2004 because there was still no funds, no building. The museum hadn't even been founded. It was still just a project. The museum was finally founded in 2005 when the Jewish NGO went to the Ministry of Culture, went to the city of Warsaw and said, let's the three of us join together in a partnership to found the museum. And that happened in 2005 with the architectural competition. We opened the building in 13. We had the grand opening in 14. We won the European Museum of the Year Award in 2016, which is the first, and we are the first and only museum in Poland ever to get this award, which is the top award in Europe. And we've had about 4 million visitors from the opening until now, which is also exceptional. There is no Jewish museum anywhere. We're not talking about Holocaust museums like Yad Vashem, but basically outside of Israel, there is no Jewish museum anywhere in the world. And I think only the Jewish Museum Berlin would come close that has this kind of visitation. So let me give you a sense of the story that we tell and what were the principles governing it. And I think this is important because I'm the chief curator. I was responsible for leading the development of the core exhibition, but I think of myself as an orchestra conductor or as a midwife, and that my task was to bring out the best in my team. And my team consisted of a wonderful design company in London called Event Communication, as well as a design company, a very good design company in Poland called Nigio Design International, an academic team, an international academic team of scholars from many disciplines in Israel, Poland, and the United States, and a young Polish curatorial team. And in working together, we had the advantage of bringing a kind of intellectual coherence to this project that was based on a set of principles. And I won't go through all of them, but let me at least touch on a few of them. I'm often asked, what's the most important period in the history of Polish Jews? And usually, when somebody asks, they already know the answer. They almost invariably say the Holocaust. If they don't say the Holocaust, it'll be the interwar years, the 1920s and 30s. That's the period that my family, my parents, my mother was born in 1915, my father in 1916. So it's a period that is close in memory, and it's the period of, for many people, their parents or their grandparents. Or it'll be the post-war period, because for Jews who are living in Poland today, that is the period that is closest to them, that they know best and feel really most affected by. But the message of our core exhibition is that the single most important period in the history of Polish Jews is 1,000 years. 1,000 years of continuous, uninterrupted Jewish presence on Polish soil, all the way up to the Holocaust, and then on a much smaller scale in the years that followed. And of course, it's also the story of Jews who left Poland and who settled elsewhere, made their homes in Canada, United States, South Africa, Australia, other parts of Europe, Israel, etc. So that's the first principle, is that, and that's why we insisted that we would not open the exhibition one gallery at a time. It had to open all of a piece, and we want our visitors to visit the whole exhibition. The second big principle is that Jews are an integral part of the history of Poland, that they're not only in Poland, but they are also of Poland, and that they created a civilization that is, as Moshe Rossman, a wonderful historian, said, it is categorically Jewish and distinctly Polish. That this is a story and this is only possible because this is a story of coexistence and conflict, cooperation and competition, separation and integration. In other words, it's a story of a spectrum of relations, and that's very important for us. And we don't treat them equally. In some moments, in some periods, one is much more dominant than the other. Then, but this is the area where Jews became the largest Jewish community in the world and a center of the Jewish world. In the 18th century, half the Jewish population in the entire world lived in the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That's 750,000 Jews. That is really, really extraordinary. And so the museum, its site, is also extremely important, that we tell the story where it happened and that we create a trusted zone for engaging really, really difficult subjects. So these are the general principles that were the basis for our approach to the historical narrative. Now, what I'd like to do is to show you those principles at work and then introduce also some of the, what I would call curatorial principles that guided how we put those historical principles to work. So we're going to walk through the exhibition together. And we've come down a very beautiful, very dramatic set of stairs that has separated us from the main floor, from the ticket counter and the cloakroom. And the idea was to put our visitors into a kind of a mood and we call a priming experience, and to prepare them for the historical narrative. And so we begin in a very counterintuitive way. We begin in a space of historical imagination. We begin in a poetic space, a space of a forest and a legend. This is a story that Jews told themselves about why they came to Poland, how they came to Poland, and why they stayed. And we use the version by Shin Agnon, the Nobel Prize winner, the great Hebrew writer, who was himself from what is today Ukraine. And there are many versions of the story. Paris has a version of it. We know it from the 19th century. And it's the story of POLIN. It's where we got our name, and it's why the word POLIN is inscribed in Hebrew and in Latin letters on the glass surface of the building. So the story goes something like this. Jews were suffering persecution in Western Europe. They were being expelled. So they ran for safe haven. They ran east. They found themselves in a forest. And in the forest, depending on the legend, the clouds broke, an angel's hand pointed, and they heard the words POLIN. Or they saw Hebrew words inscribed on the trees, or the birds chirped POLIN, or they saw pages of the Gemara floating down from the sky. When they heard POLIN, they thought that they heard Hebrew, and they interpreted those words to mean dwell or rest here, po. And they then said to themselves that it must be divinely ordained that we should come here and that we should stay here until Elijah blows the shofar, announcing the coming of the Messiah, and takes us to the Holy Land, which of course is a very, very long time. But what's astonishing is that this is a way we start our 1,000-year story, with a legend the Jews told themselves about why they came and belong and stayed in this place. And we think that it's a very counterintuitive and very evocative and very poetic way to begin. But when we leave the forest, we cross the threshold between legend and history. And when we do so, we come to the medieval period. Now, the historical narrative is divided into 7 historical galleries, and it begins with the medieval period. And we begin the medieval period in 965, which is the date of an extraordinary travel diary by a Jew from Cordoba who was sent by the Caliph on a diplomatic mission across Europe, and who left an exceptional travel account of his travels in Arabic, because this, of course, is the Golden Age in Spain. It's Muslim Spain. And so we begin because his text is the first written mention of the land of Poland in the text of a Jewish traveler from Spain. Now, so we start in 965. And the medieval period, we take it to about 1507. I can explain to you why 1507 and not 1500 or some other number. And that is more than 500 years. That is more than half of the 1,000-year story of Polish Jews. 500 years. Now, what do we have for telling this 500-year story? And what is the story? It's the story of why Jews came to Poland. Where did they come from? Why did they come? Why did they stay? What were the conditions? And how, in a 500-year period, did a few traveling merchants from the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, from a few traveling merchants, how do we get from there to the end of to 1500, when there are Jews living in 100 places in Polish territory with Jewish communities in 50 of them? How did it happen? That's the story we want to tell in the medieval gallery. Now, what do we have to tell it with? We have exactly 2 kinds of objects from this period. We have tombstones, and on the left you see the earliest Jewish tombstone from Poland. It's dated 1203, and it's from Wrocław. And we have coins, and of course these coins are the size of a dime, but they're very exceptional. They're called bracteates. They're one-sided coins. What's so exceptional is that they have Hebrew letters on them, and usually with a blessing like bracha, bracha v'hatzlacha, or the name of the king, or the name of a minter. And what that means is that Jews were in Poland and were protected by the king. They were the king's banker, so to speak, that they brought a monetary economy, and that they were given a privilege or a permission to either supervise the minting of coins or to mint a certain number of coins, and they did so with Hebrew letters. That's it. Now, we have all kinds of written sources. We have rabbinical correspondence. We have letters, chronicles, legal documents, charters, written documents, yes, but no objects except these 2. So what did we do? We took those written documents. We took manuscript illuminations from the areas from which these Jews came, meaning the Rhineland, Western Ashkenazi illuminated manuscripts from the medieval period. And we went to several of Poland's most popular comic book artists. And we said to them, we want you to take our stories that we have extracted from these medieval letters, rabbinical responsa, from these travel accounts. We want you to take the stories that we've extracted that describe what was going on in the wild East before really Jews had settled, when they're still really moving through, and we want you to illustrate them. And that's what we did. And with these illustrations, we then commissioned people who restore the interiors of historic Polish churches, medieval churches, Baroque churches, and we asked them to paint the walls of this gallery. We then hired a person that specializes in historical techniques of gilding with gold leaf, and used real gold leaf to gild the sections of the medieval gallery that deal with the relationship of Jews to the king. And the result is a hand-painted gallery. Now, this is a multimedia narrative exhibition, but we consider these analog media, like painting, we consider that part of what we consider media. So this hand-painted gallery, the result is the feeling that you are inside an illuminated manuscript that is 100%, that is human scale, 360 degrees, and that you are surrounded by it and that you are inside it. And then, of course, we deepen the story with multimedia interactive elements as well. So that is, I think it's an example of, if you will, making a virtue of necessity, of actually creating a handmade gallery in the absence of original artifacts, although we do have and own and show one medieval coin. It's the oldest object in our collection. It's from the early 13th century, and we show it, but it's the size of a dime. And on another occasion, I would love to show you how it is that we can take something so modest and actually show it in a way that's impactful. So now we move from this first historical gallery, 500 years, and we now enter the period of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is a period, now during the medieval period, Ukraine, basically Poland and Ukraine became one country. During this period, between 1569 and 1772, Lithuania and Poland-Ukraine joined together to form this Commonwealth to be stronger, to resist invasions from their very, I would say, entrepreneurial neighbors, whether it's Russia, Austria, Prussia, and formed, and you can see it, I'll show you this map in a moment, they formed perhaps, if not the biggest, one of the biggest countries in Europe, and one of the most diverse in terms of language, religion, culture, region, in every regard. It was really an extraordinarily, particularly from a religious perspective, very, very diverse country. Now, in many ways, this period of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries is considered both in, I would say, Polish history, Jewish history, as a golden age, although clearly it was not golden in all respects. But what made it a golden age from a Jewish perspective? From a Jewish perspective, it was a golden age because now Poland had become the center of the Ashkenazi Jewish world. In the medieval period, the center was on the Rhineland. It was in Western Europe. It was in the German-speaking areas. In this period, it is in Poland. And Jews in Western Europe are sending their sons to Poland, to Polish yeshivas. And Polish rabbis are now held in very high esteem. And there is Hebrew and Yiddish printing. And the second is because in this period, the Jewish community of the Commonwealth had a very high degree of self-government, of communal self-government. And this is exceptional. There is no period between the period of the temple in antiquity and the state of Israel when any Jewish community in the world had this degree of Jewish self-government, Jewish communal autonomy. Now, the challenge is, how do you communicate this? So, and how do you communicate that this was not just a golden age, but this was also an era that of, if you will, hate and violence? And we do that in a variety of ways. But a very important principle for us is to have our visitors hear, if you will, or experience the voices of the period, all the voices, the voices that are in agreement and the voices that are disagreement, and to hear them in their original Polish, Latin, Hebrew, Old Czech, German, French, whatever the language, Arabic, whatever the language might be, and in Polish and English translation. And whether these are voices in agreement or voices in disagreement, this is a kind of a play script to the theater of history that we have created. And so here is the map. And one of the most meaningful experiences for our visitors is finding their ancestral towns on this map. So this was in the medieval period, Poland, Ukraine, and Lithuania, a huge country. Now, these are very abstract ideas. How do you communicate that Poland became a center of the Ashkenazi Jewish world, that it was a center of rabbinical authority? How do you communicate that? One of the ways we found to communicate it was by presenting Hebrew and Yiddish printing. And one of the ways to engage visitors for whom all of this is really foreign, even among our Jewish visitors, was to create printing presses where they could literally print the title pages of the first of these Hebrew letter books in Poland, and also print the Jewish printer's marks, which is extremely popular. And then we bring them to interactive lecterns, these stenders, where they can use our interactive screens to explore this wonderful Kabbalistic manuscript or other of these very early Hebrew and Yiddish printed books. Now, this period was, if you will, a golden age in some ways and not golden in others. And in particular, in the 17th century, which was for the Commonwealth a century of war, the catastrophic event that is etched in Jewish memory as the worst thing that happened between the destruction of the temple and the Holocaust was the Khmelnytsky uprising in 1642-43. And this was devastating. But as a century of war with the Swedish wars and other wars, the entire Commonwealth was devastated. And it wasn't until the end of the 18th century that it recovered. And when it recovered, the nobility who owned their own private towns wanted to redevelop their towns and restore the economy. And they invited Jews to come back because about a third of the Jewish population was either killed during the Khmelnytsky uprising or fled, and some of them were forced to convert. So the recovery at the end of the century was really extraordinary. And so Jews actually then were supported by the nobility to come back. Nobility might give them or loan them or advance them money to rebuild their synagogue. And they then essentially revitalized these towns, which were the economic engine of the noble rural estates. So what we do is we go from that big picture of what we call Paradisus Judaeorum with a question mark, and we now zoom in on the most characteristic form of Jewish life in this territory, which was the small town, or the town actually, because Jews were urban. They either lived in cities, big and small, in towns, big and small, but much more rarely did they live in villages, and very rare did they live in the countryside. So they were urban, and they were extremely important in managing the assets on the noble estate, in managing villages, mills, forests, fisheries, lumber industry, the peasantry. And so we zoom in and we ask ourselves, what was daily life like for Jews in this territory in the 18th century? Well, there are two focal points. One focal point is around the marketplace, and then around the marketplace, we show Jewish life in the home, especially looking at women's lives and women's piety. We are probably the only museum of Jewish history that actually has a, quote, church, which is where we look at changing relationships between the church and the Jews. And we also look at the rise of false messiahs, in particular, the story of Frank. And of course, the second center of gravity is the synagogue and all of the religious institutions that surround the whole complex of institutions that surround the synagogue. Now, from the master plan, we'd always intended to represent the synagogue in the 18th century in the form of the wooden synagogue, because wooden synagogues were masterpieces of Jewish architecture and visual culture in this territory in the early modern period. They were magnificent, and there were over 200 of them that we know of, and they were spectacular on the outside and spectacular on the inside. And they were, by the end of the 19th century, there was a new appreciation of wooden vernacular architecture in this territory and a desire to document and preserve it. This is really from the I would say, 70s, 80s, 90s. And in that interest, there was the so-called discovery of the wooden synagogue. Now, the Germans destroyed all the great early modern wooden synagogues during World War II, during the Holocaust. They burnt them all to the ground. Not one of these magnificent synagogues was left standing, not one. But they were very well documented. And the single best documented one is the synagogue that once stood in Gwoździec, which was in Poland and is today in Ukraine, a tiny community. I don't think it had more than 1,000, it had somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 Jews. How they could build such a magnificent synagogue, it wasn't so big, but it was really special. So let me show you the documentation, and then let me show you what we did. So here, of course, is a photograph of the exterior taken before World War I. And here are the drawings that were made by a wonderful architectural historian in Vienna, who was absolutely mesmerized by this synagogue. And between I think 1910 and 1913, he made hundreds of cutaways, cross sections, floor plans, measurements, drawings, color studies. You have it. And so you can see the nature of the documentation. And Isidor Kaufmann, who is related to Sue Walsh, made this painting. And he called the area, the territory where Gwoździec was located in this period, in the later period of the 19th century, in Galicia, he called it his promised land. He was crazy about this territory, and he would spend months, and he would go into these painted wooden interiors of these synagogues, and he would paint these interiors. And this is a painting of the interior of the Gwoździec wooden synagogue, which is absolutely astonishing. It gives us a color reference. So it doesn't exist. What are we going to do? So we decided to work with a wonderful educational studio in and their motto is to recover lost objects. What they say is you can never recover the original object in the sense of the original material, but what you can recover is the knowledge of how to build it by building it using traditional tools, materials, and techniques. And that's what we did. In other words, the tangible heritage, the material heritage is unrecoverable, but the intangible heritage, the heritage of the knowledge of how to build it, can be recovered, but it can only be recovered by building it. And you'll see that what results. What results is a kind of materializing of the recovered knowledge. So we partnered with an open air folk architecture museum in the south of Poland, just nearby Sanok. We had 200 raw logs with the bark still on delivered. We partnered with the Timber Framers Guild of America and other timber framers from across Europe who love working with historical tools and using historical techniques. And they arrived with their adzes and their axes and their pit saws in ski bags and in golf bags. I don't know how they got them through security and customs. It's like Lord of the Rings. And they engaged volunteers, young students who had never picked up a screwdriver, and taught them how to use these tools in order to complete the timber framing of the roof and the synagogue ceiling, which we then took this whole thing apart. It's put together with wooden pegs, brought the parts to the museum, reassembled it, hoisted it, it's 25 tons, suspended it from the ceiling, and then we completed also the painted ceiling in segments with a team of volunteers using traditional pigments. And we did that inside still standing masonry synagogues across the length and breadth of Poland. And this is the result. It's 85% scale. The bima, the platform, is about 100% scale. And then, of course, we surround it with the story, really, of Jewish religious life in this period. And of course, it is, I think, probably the most memorable experience. And you can see signs of the zodiac, the bestiary, all kinds of wonderful, wonderful iconography. And of course, the young kids, we just love. They walk around like turtles with these cushions on their back, and we encourage them to lie down, enjoy this, and then we have workshops with them. And of course, we have made it possible to see inside the timber framing from the main floor of the exhibition, where we also provide the archival material. And so that really is the period of Paradisus Judaeorum with a question mark, a golden age that wasn't actually golden in all regards, a period when the Commonwealth was at its biggest and its strongest, its most diverse. And then 1772, the country's actually very decentralized. It's a republic of nobles. It has a weak army. And the surrounding empires and the Kingdom of Prussia decide to each take a piece of the royal cake. And you can see here the map of Poland being torn up, and there's the last king of Poland. His crown is sliding off his head, and we are now in the long 19th century, a century in which there is no more Poland on the map, but rather the piece that Austria took, the piece that Russia took, the piece that Prussia took, and Jews are now living within those empires and that kingdom under a whole new set of rules, it's a whole new ball game. And so this is how we open that story. This is how we try to communicate that we are now in a new geopolitical situation. And it's really a story that we call Encounters with Modernity. And we look at the impact on everyday life, on dress reform, on new role for rabbis, on conscription, on educational requirements, language, marriage age, on many, many aspects of everyday Jewish life that the Jews had to contend with, whether they accepted them, whether they celebrated them, or whether they resisted them. And that takes us to also collective responses, the Jewish Enlightenment, the rise of the modern yeshiva, the absolute explosion of Hasidism, which became a really mass movement. And again, we I would say, made a virtue of necessity, because for the modern yeshiva, which we basically start with the yeshiva of Volozhin, which was established in 1803, and is really the legacy of the Vilna Gaon, we had no visual material, no objects, no photographs, no paintings, nothing except incredible memoirs. And based on those memoirs, we were able to produce a film, 24 hours in the yeshiva of Volozhin, 24 hours in 4 minutes, 47 seconds, from dusk to dusk, or from dawn to dawn. And it was based entirely on on one of the memoirs of a very enthusiastic young man who was completely taken by the pedagogy of the modern yeshiva, which really was an extraordinary pedagogy. We cast live actors. We actually painted them. They included a boy that was born and raised in Poland and had just had his bar mitzvah. We then proceeded to insert the live actors into the computer visualization. We then projected the film on canvas and refilmed it so you could see the weave of the canvas. And the effect is of a 19th century painting that has come to life. We come to the middle of the 19th century, and that is a story of industrialization, of the railway, the rise of an industrial city like the city of Lodz. It is a story of enormous demographic expansion, urbanization, industrialization, and the transformation of Jewish life in many respects, both cultural and political. The rise of modern political movements, the rise of the Bund, of Zionism, of the Aguda, the religious party. It is the story of the rise of modern Hebrew culture, literature, theater, the rise of modern Yiddish culture, and of course with Yud Lamed Peretz at the very, very center of it. It is also the moment in the 1880s of the mass pogroms and of mass immigration. From the 1880 to World War I is the period of the greatest emigration of Jews from Eastern Europe. About a third of the Jewish population emigrated in that period, with I think 1907 being the peak year. So it's a very, very rich, very tumultuous period, and it is what we really show in the second half of the 19th century. And then this period, this long 19th century, ends with the outbreak of World War II, and with the outbreak of with the end of outbreak of World War I, and at the end of World War I, Poland regains its independence. When it regains its independence, it forms the Second Polish Republic, a very, very short period of time from 1918 until 1939. That was the period of Polish independence. It was followed by occupied Poland during the war, and then by communist Poland, and then finally after 89 by the People's Republic, the People's Polish Republic, which was, if you will, the Third Republic. But those 2 decades were really consequential, and so we treat them in a way that's actually essential to how we approach the entire exhibition. And what that means is that we try to keep our visitors in the moment of the story. We ask them, please do not anticipate the Holocaust. Please do not look at this entire history through the lens of the Holocaust. Don't foreshadow. Don't backshadow. Stay in the moment of the story. Stay with those whose story we're telling, because they don't know what's coming next. They didn't have a crystal ball. They didn't have hindsight. And so this story that we tell in the interwar years is very much about how, despite economic hardship, the devastation after World War I, the Great Depression, despite rising anti-Semitism, which was at its absolute worst in the last 5 years of the 1930s, despite all of that, this was a vibrant period of political activity, it was vibrant not only politically, but also in terms of cultural activity in Yiddish. It was a period in which Jews formed a Jewish school system in Yiddish, in Hebrew, high schools in Jewish high schools in Polish, as well as the whole religious school system, of which they were enormously proud. Jewish kids, and I know about them from my father, and I'm showing you here the toys that he taught me to make that I made for the exhibition. I managed to smuggle him in to the section on childhood. And all of this we have created thematically on a street, and we call this On the Jewish Street, which is a kind of metaphor for, if you will, what's doing in the Jewish world on 2 levels. And the way that we do this is it's divided into culture, politics, growing up, daily life. But when you look down the street, you don't see the Holocaust. This was extremely important to us because the Jews in our period did not see it coming. And in fact, Poles in the period didn't believe the Germans were going to invade. It wasn't until weeks, maybe 2 months before the German invasion on September 1st, 1939, that there was this awareness that the Germans would invade, and they didn't believe that if the Germans invaded, they would succeed in occupying Poland. So that's why it was important for us that when you look down the street, you don't see the Holocaust. But what do you see? What you see is only when you turn the corner, and when you turn the corner, you see people looking up. And this is the American ambassador and his staff outside the American embassy looking up, and what they see is the Germans dropping bombs on Poland. And now we enter the Holocaust Gallery. And what's very special about the way in which the Holocaust sits within the museum is that it is the Holocaust as it took place within the borders of occupied Poland, which are the borders of the Second Polish Republic. And it is the Holocaust as understood within those borders. What did Jews inside those borders know about what was happening outside and what was happening inside? And we have the benefit, the enormous benefit of being able to tell this story from the perspective of the Warsaw Ghetto, because we are a site-specific museum. We're sitting on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto, and the Warsaw Ghetto is also extraordinary for the documentation that was created by the Oynik Shabbos underground archive. And just to give you a sense of it, the purple area is the ghetto. 30% of Warsaw's population, 300,000 Jews, were forced into 2.4% of the city's area, with more than 200,000 persons per square mile and 9.2 people per room, just to give you a sense of what our starting point is. Now, consistent with our approach, we tell the story from multiple perspectives. From the perspective of the diary of Adam Chernyakov, who was the head of the Judenrat, and from the perspective of Emanuel Ringelblum, who was the head of this clandestine project, Oynik Shabbos, the underground archive, to document everything that was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto and beyond, because of couriers that brought information, refugees that also brought information about what was happening outside the ghetto and in other ghettos and in other places in occupied Poland. And so that archive, which is really, really exceptional, most of it or much of it was preserved. And we use it to present the Holocaust in Poland and specifically the story of the Warsaw Ghetto from the perspective of those who were documenting it in real time. They were documenting it as it was happening. They knew and they felt that the moment that they were living in was already historical even before it was over. And so what they did was they gathered they made these documents. They had originally intended to use them after the war to write a history of the Warsaw Ghetto. But in fact, they realized when the Great Deportation began in the summer of 1942 that it was unlikely they would survive. So they packed this material up in these tin boxes and buried them. Then, with the Great Deportation, at the end of the Great Deportation, there were only maybe 60,000 or so, 60, 70,000 Jews left in the ghetto, and the ghetto became a labor camp. And then in April of 1943, in the weeks preceding it, when they were preparing for the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, they realized that this was the end, and they packed up the rest of the secret archive in milk cans and tin boxes, and they buried the second cache. And then those who survived, 3 members of this team of about 60 people, of volunteers who survived, went out into that ocean of rubble, and they were able to find the first cache of the tin boxes and to bring them to the Jewish Historical Institute. Just one second. They were able to bring them to the Jewish Historical Institute, where they were able to open the boxes up. And then in 1950s, the milk cans were found when earth moving equipment was digging a foundation for a building. And the workers wanted to save the milk cans and throw out the contents. But the foreman said, no, 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 that's Jewish writing. Let's give it to the Jewish Historical Institute. So that's the material. And we don't confine ourselves to the Warsaw Ghetto. We also look at Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust, from the absolute worst to the most noble, in the case of Poles who actually risked their lives and their families' lives to save Jews. And then, of course, we come to the end of the war, and we then enter the post-war period. Now, many said that we should have stopped at the post-war, at the end of the Holocaust, but we said no. We think it's critically important to bring the story up to the present, and that's what we did. Now, the biggest question for Jews who survived, and not many survived, there were 3,300,000 Jews living in Poland before the war, and about 90% of them were murdered. Most of those who survived by deportation in the Soviet Union. Only about 50,000 Jews survived outside the Soviet Union, maybe 25,000 in occupied Poland, 25,000 in the camps. And so when Jews came back, the Jewish population after the war in Poland was about 250,000 Jews. The biggest question for them was to stay or to leave. And we tell the story of staying on the left-hand side of the gallery, and we tell the story of leaving on the right-hand side. And those of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Kielce pogrom, July 4th, 1946. This was absolutely devastating, but it was not the only case. And we present other cases here. The names of the towns are on the wall. They're only a sample. But as a result of this absolutely traumatic event, there was emigration panic. And over 150,000 Jews emigrated. They left. And over the course of the decades that followed, the Jews that stayed in Poland, we explore what Jewish life looked like under communism, but we also explore the whole process of emigration as the doors opened and the doors closed to leaving Poland. The last major wave was in March 1968. We've just commemorated the 50th anniversary in 2018 of this anti-Semitic communist government-sponsored campaign, as a result of which over 13,000 Jews emigrated on one-way travel documents, having to give up their citizenship and being told they could never return to Poland. And that left at the time about 6,000 Jews in Poland. That is from 3,300,000 before the war, 250,000 after the war, this was devastating. And there was the feeling that the story was over. There was nothing more to be said. But in fact, the story wasn't over, and the story isn't over. And with the fall of communism in 1989, there has been a renewal of Jewish life on a small scale. And we have the opportunity to hear about it from Jews who were born and who live in Poland today through video interviews that we present in the final historical gallery. But that's not the end of the story. And in the last year, we have been developing two new areas. One in a beautiful space on the main floor overlooking the monument that we call Legacy, which is devoted to distinguished Polish Jews and their achievements and their contributions to world civilization, Polish civilization, and Jewish civilization, and also the story of us, of those of us whose families come from Poland and who have emigrated and formed their lives elsewhere. Believe it or not, these are the Opters. These are all the Toronto Opters from Opatów, my father's town. And I was amazed to get an email that said, we want everybody to get together on Sunday, such and such. We want to take a picture, a photograph of all the Opters. And look who turned up, including infants. So there have to be 5 generations in this image: Holocaust survivors, their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, all of them feeling connected to their hometown, Opatów, or Opt in Yiddish, which is my father's hometown. He was an Opter. I belong to the Opters. We want to tell our story, and we want to tell it beautifully in the central circulation space of the museum. And last but not least, as we approach Yom HaShoah, as we approach the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising on April 19th, we hope you will join us in our commemorative action, which is our Daffodils campaign. And in the chat, I have put links where you can find out more about it and where we can actually mail you a beautiful paper daffodil that you can wear on April 19th, inspired by Marek Edelman, one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, who every year would receive a bouquet of yellow daffodils anonymously, and he would leave them at the base of the Monument to the Ghetto Heroes. And so I thank you very, very much for your kind attention. And I hope that even though our hour is up, that we might have time for at least a few questions.
Barbara, that was unbelievable and really fascinating. I first want to thank Gail Kurtzman and Beth Tikva for enabling this program to happen and you to bring it to us. So please, if you have questions, put them into the chat. I'm curious, Barbara, there was an exhibition at the Warsaw Museum about 1968 that raised a lot of controversy, I think, last year, 2 years ago. Can you comment on that and the reaction of people in the museum to what's going on now?
Oh, absolutely. So, you know, a key to our ability to do adventurous shows that take risks and that create controversy is that we are a private-public partnership, that the Ministry of Culture cannot unilaterally appoint or fire our director, and that our private partner has to be in on those decisions, but also our private partner fundraises for us so that we are not completely dependent on funding from the city and the ministry, from the state, basically. So as a result, we did an exhibition that this Ministry of Culture, I don't know how the earlier one might have seen it, but this Ministry of Culture didn't like at all. The exhibition was called Estranged, March 68 and its aftermath. And in Polish, it was obce w domu, meaning strangers at home. And he said, what do you mean strangers at home? Jews and Poles, they're brothers, they always got along. So he didn't like the title, he didn't like the idea, and their historical policy is to defend the good name of Poland. And so an exhibition that focused on an anti-Semitic campaign, even though it was the communist government and it was 50 years ago, for them, it's not a way to defend the good name of Poland. They don't want to hear about it. So that was the first thing. Okay, well, but we got to make the exhibition, do the public programs, publish the book, and we raised the money for it. And so, okay, but what happened? The very last section, and what we do this all the time, is that we incorporate contemporary art, we relate historical events to the contemporary situation. The very, very last section, identified statements being made today by politicians, TV presenters, public figures, in social media, on TV, radio, and in print media, statements being made today that were virtually identical to the anti-Semitic statements made in 1968, 50 years earlier. Now, we put those statements up. We erased the names of the speakers because we were not saying anything about the person. The person may not even have realized it's an anti-Semitic statement. Quite often, they don't even know. It's the statement that was anti-Semitic. And so the person is invisible. However, somebody came to the exhibition, they saw one of these tweets, and they recognized who said it. And they went back to this woman, a Mrs. Ogurek, and they said, you know, your tweet is in that exhibition. And they said it's anti-Semitic. She said, what? So she immediately wrote a letter to the director, and she said, you must remove that immediately, and I want a public apology. And our director, Darius Stola, who was a marvelous director, marvelous, and a great historian, he said, no, I won't do that, but I invite you to the museum. I want to show you the exhibition, and I want to talk with you about that section and what we were trying to do. No, if you don't do it, I'm taking you to court. And he took him to court. She took him to court. And three of the best lawyers or law firms in the country immediately called him and said, we'll represent you pro bono. Any event, long story short, the court case, either she withdrew or the case was thrown out. It never actually came to anything. But had it come to something, it would have been a great teaching moment, a great exercise in trying to really address what the issue is. So you want to know, I know you want to know, what was the tweet?
Yeah.
So there is a wonderful senator, and he is obviously to the left of center. And she was in some kind of an argument with him. And one of her tactics, if you can imagine, one of her tactics in trying to somehow rather undermine, not his argument, but undermine him, was to say to him, Mr. Borowski, what was your name before it was Borowski? Now that was a way in 68 of outing Jews. Now they might have adopted a Polish name during the Holocaust as a way of passing as Polish, or they might have adopted it after the Holocaust because they didn't want to be visible as Jewish. There's all kinds of reasons why people, change their names. Now, as it turns out, it was his father who changed his name, but that's irrelevant. Now, what was his name before they changed it to Borowski? It was Berman. So that is a kind of it's not even a dog whistle because everybody can hear it, not just dogs. It is an out and out, I would say, standard way of essentially outing somebody as Jewish as a deficit. Mm. And so that was what created the brouhaha. Well, as a result of this controversy, 117,000 people came to this exhibition and set a record for an exhibition of this kind, for attendance at an exhibition of this kind in Poland. It set an absolute record. And people said, you didn't have to do any marketing. The government did it for you.
You've got a question in that regard from Anita. How does that connect with the recent court case against the authors who published the book about anti-Semitism in Poland?
Well, I think you're thinking of Jan Grabowski and Barbara Engelking, and their book is actually about how Jews responded to the violence of their Polish neighbors against them.
Okay.
In I think several provinces in Poland. Right. So that is actually one in a whole series of efforts to control what can be said about the relationship between Poland in quotation marks. I put it in quotation marks because when we say Poland, what do we mean? Do we mean the Polish state? Do we mean Polish society? Do we mean Polish individuals? What is Polish shorthand for? Because that's really a huge issue. So it's one in a series. Jan Gross, they also tried to take away his medals. They tried to, bring him to court. That went nowhere. And he really made incendiary statements. He made a statement in the German press that Poles killed more Jews than Germans during the war. Right. So, and you can imagine that has not gone away. That's so incendiary. So Jan Gross was up for all of that. Jan Grabowski has, suffered all of these I would say, efforts to somehow discredit him. And this is the most recent. And you have to see in the context of this amendment to this law to defend the good name of Poland, where they were trying to criminalize statements that would hold Poland as a state and as a nation co-responsible for the Holocaust along with the Germans. And they wanted to criminalize it. That would include, like, it could be jail and a fine. And then through negotiations, they sort of reduced the penalty. But I would say that that's the wider context. Now, in the case of Grabowski and Engelking's book, which has been widely praised, really, as an extraordinary, it's a 2-volume work with thousands of pages. The issue is actually one sentence. And the case was brought by a group that is funded by the government, but it's independent of the government, that is looking for opportunities to prosecute what they think of as statements that defame the good name of Poland. And in this instance, it had to do with the mayor of a town and his 80-year-old niece, and a statement about him turning Jews in. And it's complicated. There are 2 mayors of the same town that both have the same name. So you can imagine the confusion. So that's basically, so now they're supposed to, they don't have to pay a fine. They're supposed to make a public apology, and they're appealing because they don't want to do that either.
There's a question from Shirley on, is there a special place to trace your ancestors?
Yes. Yes, there is. We have a resource center. We have specialists in genealogy. We have access to all kinds of genealogical databases and other kinds of records. And our team is able to work in multiple languages. So Polish, Russian, German, Yiddish, Hebrew, English, obviously, and for some of them also Ukrainian, Belarusian. So it depends. But and they also know how to get to records in local archives that have not been digitized. And they're very, very happy to help and get people started, and also help if you're already along the way and there are particular things you're looking for.
Barbara, we have so many questions. A lot of people firstly want to come to Poland, me included. I was due to be there a year ago in April. I had booked and couldn't. Is there a way to get in touch with you if people have questions after?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Send something to me and I can put it out.
Yes, in fact, I put a number of links in the chat, and we'll
send that out to people.
And when we send out the follow-up message, I'll provide contact information for me.
Thank you.
And those links, and I can also provide some interesting things to read, some interesting things to watch. I think, and also some ways to start if you haven't begun doing genealogical research, some ways to start even before you come to Poland or contact us.
Great. And for those people, we are recording today's lecture and it will be available in a few days. So if you want to watch it again. Before we end, I think a lot of people have the same question. What is sort of the future plan for the museum? Do young people in Poland come to see this museum?
Yes, the answer is, well, I would say that we have a really great demographic because we do, it's a very family-centered country. There is a tremendous, tremendous value placed on families. It's a very Catholic country. There are government subsidies that are encouraging, supporting families and encouraging them to have kids and to be able to care for them well. So it's in that way, we have been very attentive to serving families and families with very, very young children. We have a special family area. We have special family tools and
the question is geared to the non-Jewish people. Like, is there?
Well, now, okay. So first and foremost, I would say that. Well, let me give you the visitor breakdown and then respond to the question about young people. In the height of the season, well, when we first opened, it was about 70% Polish, 30% international, half the international Jewish, half of that diaspora, half Israel. Okay, so that's the beginning. Now, in the high season, from let's say March through October, we are about 50-50. I mean, not during the pandemic year, obviously. So I'm talking really about 2019. About 50-50 Polish, 50 international, and again, a similar breakdown. In the low season, meaning the cold winter period, let's say November through February, then again, it goes up and it's more the Polish visitors, less international visitors, which is completely understandable. So that's the first thing in terms of demographics. In terms of age, generation, because of our strong family programs, we're really getting really good results. We have a strong program for the schools. We have an exceptional educational program. We have over 36 people working in our education department, and we have a very big grant from Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, because they are not part of the European Union, so they do their own philanthropy, and they have given us now two rounds of support for our educational programs, and that means primary school, secondary school. So that is very strong. We have a museum on wheels that goes out to small towns across the length and breadth of Poland with populations under 50,000. And we have a lot of people who are late teens, 20s, early 30s. So, it's not like some museums where they're getting, my demographic, basically, people in their 60s, 70s, and up. It's really very, I would say, it's very across the board. And we are very attentive to disabilities. We have special days or times of day for example, families with autism, where it's low light, low sensory. We have incredible, we are a venue for this incredible theater company called Theater 21, which is a Down syndrome theater cast that are just phenomenal, and they perform in our space. So, and also for seniors, people with memory issues, obviously hearing impaired, sign language, visually impaired with audio description. I mean, it's just across the board.
Barbara, I have to say, it sounds truly, truly remarkable. And I think you've inspired all of our audience. I hate to cut it off, but I know that it's been just the most wonderful, wonderful hour, and we could go on asking questions. I'd like to thank you again for sharing this with us. I'd like to thank Beth Tikva for partnering with us, and Gail for all your hard work, and really also to the Kwinter family for co-sponsoring this in memory of their family. We do have from Classy Lectures, I will say, 3 wonderful programs in commemoration of Yom HaShoah, one on music from the emigres tomorrow, one on degenerate art on Thursdays, and one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto, Anya Levitch and Pavel Powell, on Wednesday. So please join us. Take a look at classylearning.com. And really, we're all looking forward to going to Poland.